Picture this. A young man, barely 18, creeps through the darkness of a Messenian village. His heart pounds not with fear, but with anticipation. In his hand, a bronze blade glints in the moonlight. This isn't a warrior heading to battle against foreign enemies. This is a Spartan youth on his first sanctioned murder. His target, an unarmed helot farmer returning from the fields, whose only crime was being born into slavery. This scene, repeated countless times across the Spartan countryside, reveals the horrifying truth behind one of history's most celebrated military societies. While Hollywood movies and history books celebrate Spartan valor at Thermopylae, they conveniently forget the ocean of blood that built their legendary warrior culture. The 300 Spartans who faced the Persian horde were sustained by nearly 200,000 enslaved helots, people whose suffering and systematic brutalization made Spartan military excellence possible. The helot system wasn't just slavery as we typically understand it. It was something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated reign of terror designed to break human spirits across generations. What the Spartans did to their slaves makes the worst excesses of other ancient civilizations pale in comparison. This is the story they don't want you to know, the blood-soaked foundation upon which Spartan glory was built. To understand the horrors that followed, we must first understand how this system of institutionalized terror came to be. The story begins not with noble warriors, but with conquest, genocide, and the deliberate subjugation of entire populations. When the Spartans first arrived in the fertile valley of Laconia around the 10th century BCE, they weren't the disciplined military machine we know from legend. They were just another tribe of Greek settlers looking for good farmland. But what set them apart was their solution to a problem that plagued all ancient societies: how to maintain a warrior class while ensuring food production. Most Greek city-states relied on free farmers who could be called up for military service when needed. The Spartans chose a different path, one that would define their society for centuries to come. Rather than sharing the land with the indigenous population or integrating them as citizens, they decided to enslave them entirely. The first victims were the Laconian people themselves. Spartan warriors swept through their settlements, killing the men who resisted and enslaving the survivors. But this was just the beginning. The real horror started with the conquest of Messenia, their neighbors to the west. The First Messenian War, 743 to 724 BCE, wasn't just a military campaign. It was a systematic campaign of enslavement. Spartan forces didn't simply defeat Messenian armies. They hunted down every man, woman, and child in the region. Those who survived the initial conquest found themselves stripped not just of their freedom, but of their very identity. The Spartans had a term for what they did to the Messenians. They called them helots, derived from the word helos, meaning captured. But this wasn't just a change in name. It was the beginning of a social experiment in human degradation that would last for centuries. Unlike slaves in other Greek cities, who were often foreigners captured in distant wars, helots were the original inhabitants of the land the Spartans now claimed. They knew every hill, every stream, every secret path. They outnumbered their masters by ratios that should have made rebellion inevitable. The Spartan solution to this problem would prove to be one of the most psychologically sophisticated and brutally effective systems of oppression in human history. The helots weren't just forced to work, they were forced to remember. Spartan law required them to wear distinctive clothing that marked their status as slaves. They were forbidden from owning weapons, traveling without permission, or gathering in groups. But most insidiously, they were forced to participate in rituals designed to reinforce their subordinate status. Every year, in a ceremony that would make modern psychologists recoil in horror, the Spartan ephors, magistrates, would formally declare war on the helot population. This wasn't a metaphorical declaration. It was a legal framework that made killing helots not just permissible, but praiseworthy. Young Spartans who murdered helots weren't criminals. They were patriots serving their state. The psychological impact of this annual declaration cannot be overstated. Imagine living your entire life knowing that your masters had legally declared you an enemy of the state, that your death was not just permitted but encouraged. This wasn't slavery as practiced elsewhere in the ancient world. This was systematic psychological warfare designed to crush the human spirit. If the annual declaration of war was the legal framework for helot oppression, the Krypteia was its most horrifying practical application. This institution, whose very name means secret or hidden, represents perhaps the most chilling example of how the Spartans turned murder into education and terror into statecraft. The Krypteia wasn't a military unit in any conventional sense. It was a coming-of-age ritual for young Spartan men, typically those around 18 years old who had shown exceptional promise in their military training. These weren't hardened veterans seeking glory in battle. They were teenagers being taught that killing defenseless people was not just acceptable, but necessary for their development as Spartan citizens. The process began each autumn, when the most promising young men from the Agoj, Spartan education system, were selected for this honor. They were given minimal supplies, a cloak, a dagger, and basic rations, and sent into the countryside with a simple mission: kill helots. But this wasn't a random slaughter. The Krypteia operated with chilling efficiency and purpose. The young Spartans were specifically instructed to target helots who showed signs of leadership, intelligence, or physical strength. The goal wasn't just murder, it was selective breeding through assassination, an attempt to prevent the emergence of anyone who might organize resistance. Ancient sources describe how these young killers would hide during the day and emerge at night to hunt their human prey. They would lurk near roads, waiting for helots returning from the fields. They would observe helot communities, identifying those who seemed to have influence or respect among their peers. Then, under cover of darkness, they would strike. Ancient sources describe how these young killers would hide during the day and emerge at night to hunt their human prey. They would lurk near roads, waiting for helots returning from the fields. They would observe helot communities, identifying those who seemed to have influence or respect among their peers. Then, under cover of darkness, they would strike. One particularly chilling account from Plutarch describes how the Krypteia would sometimes announce their presence to helot communities, creating a reign of terror that lasted for days. Young Spartans would enter a village at sunset, making it clear they were there to kill, but not revealing who their targets were. Families would spend sleepless nights wondering if they would see the dawn, if their sons or fathers had attracted the deadly attention of their masters. The selection criteria for Krypteia victims reveals the calculated nature of this terror. Physical strength was dangerous because it might enable resistance. Intelligence was dangerous because it might lead to organization. But perhaps most tellingly, the Krypteia also targeted helots who showed too much pride or self-respect. The goal wasn't just to prevent rebellion, it was to create a population so psychologically broken that rebellion became unthinkable. The young Spartans who participated in the Krypteia weren't acting as rogue elements or sadistic individuals. They were fulfilling a state mandate, carrying out what their society considered essential education. Successful participation in helot murder was often a prerequisite for advancement in Spartan society. The ability to kill defenseless people wasn't seen as a character flaw. It was seen as evidence of the emotional control and unwavering loyalty that made a good Spartan citizen. This systematic murder served multiple purposes beyond just preventing rebellion. It created a generation of Spartan leaders who had been desensitized to violence against their own subjects. Men who had killed helots as teenagers could order their deaths as adults without hesitation. The Krypteia wasn't just about controlling the helot population. It was about shaping the souls of future Spartan leaders. The psychological impact on the helot community was devastating and long-lasting. Parents lived in constant fear for their children. Talented individuals learned to hide their abilities. Communities became fragmented as people became suspicious of anyone who might attract fatal attention. The Krypteia created a culture of fear so pervasive that it became self-perpetuating, with helots policing their own behavior and that of their neighbors. While the Krypteia represented the most extreme form of helot oppression, the daily lived experience of helot slavery was itself a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological destruction. The Spartans understood that breaking people's spirits was just as important as breaking their bodies, and they developed a comprehensive system of humiliation designed to remind helots of their subhuman status every single day. The assault on helot dignity began with their appearance. Spartan law required helots to wear a distinctive uniform, a rough woolen cap called a kuni and a leather jerkin. But this wasn't just about identification, it was about degradation. The kuni was deliberately designed to look ridiculous, a pointed cap that made the wearer appear foolish and childlike. The leather jerkin was often made from poorly treated hides that would crack and smell in the heat, marking the wearer as unclean. But clothing was just the beginning. Helots were forbidden from grooming themselves in ways that might suggest dignity or self-respect. They were required to let their hair grow long and unkempt, creating a wild, savage appearance that reinforced Spartan stereotypes about their supposed inferiority. Some sources suggest that helots were also forced to perform degrading grooming rituals, such as plucking their beards in patterns that would make them objects of ridicule. The psychological warfare extended to every aspect of daily interaction. Helots were required to step off roads when Spartans approached, literally removing themselves from their master's path. They were forbidden from looking Spartans directly in the eye, a rule that reinforced their status as less than human. When addressing any Spartan, regardless of age, helots were required to use subservient language and postures that emphasized their inferior status. Perhaps most insidiously, the Spartans institutionalized public humiliation as entertainment. During religious festivals and public gatherings, helots were forced to perform degrading acts for the amusement of their masters. They were made to sing songs that mocked their own people and praised their Spartan overlords. They were forced to dance in ways that emphasized their supposed barbarism and inferiority. The drinking parties of young Spartans, called syssitia, regularly featured helot humiliation as entertainment. Helots would be forced to drink unmixed wine, something that would cause rapid intoxication and loss of control, and then made to perform for the laughing Spartans. They might be forced to sing off-key songs, tell self-deprecating jokes, or engage in physical comedy that reinforced stereotypes about helot stupidity and worthlessness. But the cruelest aspect of these performances was their educational purpose. Young Spartans were taught to view helots not as human beings capable of dignity and suffering, but as objects of ridicule whose degradation was both natural and necessary. Children who grew up watching helots being humiliated learned to see such treatment as normal and justified. The economic exploitation of helots was structured to maximize not just profit, but psychological damage. Unlike slaves in other Greek cities, who might have opportunities to earn money or eventually purchase their freedom, helots were trapped in a system designed to prevent any possibility of advancement. They were required to deliver a fixed portion of their agricultural produce to their Spartan masters, but the quotas were set so high that helots could barely survive, let alone accumulate any wealth. This economic structure served a dual purpose. It kept helots on the edge of starvation, making them too focused on basic survival to organize resistance. But it also created a perpetual state of dependence that reinforced their subordinate position. Helots who worked harder or more efficiently didn't improve their own condition. They simply provided more luxury for their masters. The Spartans also used family relationships as weapons against helot dignity. Children were sometimes taken from their parents to serve in Spartan households, creating bonds of affection that could be used to ensure compliance. Helot women were sexually available to their masters, not just as a matter of property rights, but as a deliberate assault on helot family structures and male dignity. The systematic nature of this humiliation extended even to death. When helots died, they were often denied proper burial rights, their bodies disposed of in ways that would horrify their families and communities. This wasn't just practical convenience. It was a final assault on human dignity that continued even beyond death. One of the most psychologically twisted aspects of the Spartan helot system was how the very people who were brutalized and dehumanized were sometimes forced to fight and die for their oppressors. The practice of arming helots and sending them into battle represents a particularly cruel form of exploitation that reveals the depths of Spartan cynicism about human life and dignity. The contradiction was stark and intentional. The same helots who were forbidden from carrying so much as a knife in peacetime were handed spears and shields when Sparta needed cannon fodder for its wars. The same people who were hunted and murdered by the Krypteia were expected to risk their lives protecting the very system that oppressed them. This practice began during the Persian Wars, when Sparta's manpower needs exceeded what their small citizen population could provide. At the Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE, historical sources record that each of the 5,000 Spartan hoplites was accompanied by 7 helots, a ratio that reveals just how dependent the Spartan war machine was on enslaved labor, even in combat. But these helot warriors weren't given the honor and equipment of true soldiers. They were deliberately equipped with inferior weapons and armor, marking them as expendable troops whose primary purpose was to absorb enemy attacks and tire opposing forces before the real Spartan soldiers engaged. Their shields bore no proud emblems, their armor offered minimal protection, and their weapons were often second-hand equipment discarded by their masters. The psychological cruelty of this system was breathtaking. Helots were told that military service offered a path to freedom and respect, but this was largely a lie designed to motivate them to fight effectively. The few helots who survived multiple campaigns and showed exceptional bravery might be granted a limited form of freedom called neodemode status. But even this supposed liberation came with severe restrictions and social stigma. The most horrifying example of helot military exploitation occurred during the Peloponnesian War. According to Thucydides, the Spartans became concerned about the loyalty of helots who had served with distinction in their armies. These veteran helot soldiers had gained confidence, skills, and dangerous ideas about their own worth. The Spartan solution was characteristically brutal and calculating. The authorities announced that they would select the bravest helots who had served in the military and grant them freedom as a reward for their service. Over 2,000 helots came forward, proud of their military accomplishments and hoping for liberation. They were honored in public ceremonies, given wreaths, and paraded around religious sites as examples of how the Spartan system could reward merit. Then they were quietly murdered. Every single one of these 2,000 helots was eliminated, not because they posed an immediate threat, but because their competence and confidence made them potentially dangerous. Thucydides notes that no one ever knew how any of them perished, a phrase that captures the calculated secrecy with which Sparta eliminated people whose only crime was being too capable. This mass murder of helot veterans reveals the fundamental cynicism at the heart of the Spartan system. Military service wasn't genuinely offered as a path to betterment. It was a tool for identifying and eliminating potentially dangerous individuals. The Spartans were willing to use helot military skills when convenient, but they had no intention of allowing those skills to translate into genuine social advancement. The psychological impact on the helot community was devastating. Families who had been proud of their sons' military service learned that success could be more dangerous than failure. Parents began to discourage their children from showing bravery or competence in military contexts, knowing that distinction could lead to death. The practice also created internal divisions within helot communities. Some helots, desperate for any possibility of advancement, continued to serve enthusiastically in Spartan armies despite the obvious risks. Others refused military service entirely, accepting punishment rather than contributing to their own oppression. These divisions weakened Helot solidarity and made organized resistance more difficult. The Spartans also used military service as a form of psychological manipulation, creating artificial hierarchies within the Helot population. Helots who served in multiple campaigns were given slightly better treatment than those who hadn't, creating incentives for cooperation and competition rather than unity. The small number of Helots who achieved neodemode status served as examples of what might be possible, even though genuine freedom remained largely illusory. The ultimate cruelty was that Helot military service often pitted enslaved people against others fighting for their own freedom. When Sparta fought against cities that threatened to liberate Helot populations, they forced Helots to take up arms against their potential liberators. The psychological damage of being forced to fight against one's own interests represents one of the most sophisticated forms of oppression ever devised. Perhaps no aspect of the Helot system reveals its true horror more clearly than how it treated children. The Spartans understood that maintaining their system of oppression required not just controlling adults, but systematically breaking the spirits of Helot children before they could develop any sense of dignity or hope. The methods they used were sophisticated, brutal, and devastatingly effective. From the moment of birth, Helot children entered a world designed to teach them that they were less than human. Unlike Spartan children, who were examined for fitness and either accepted into society or left to die, Helot children were allowed to live regardless of physical condition, not out of compassion, but because even disabled Helots could perform some form of labor. This distinction sent a clear message. Spartan children were valuable individuals whose lives mattered, while Helot children were merely future property. The education, or rather miseducation, of Helot children was carefully structured to prevent them from developing the skills, confidence, or knowledge that might enable resistance. While young Spartans attended the Agoge where they learned reading, music, and military skills, Helot children were deliberately kept ignorant. They were forbidden from learning to read or write, ensuring they could never organize effectively or communicate with distant communities. But the Spartans went beyond mere denial of education. They actively taught Helot children to despise themselves and their heritage. Helot children were required to attend certain public ceremonies where they would witness their parents and relatives being humiliated. They watched as adult Helots were forced to perform degrading dances, sing self-mocking songs, and submit to public ridicule. These experiences taught children that submission and degradation were the natural state of their people. The psychological manipulation of Helot children was particularly evident in religious contexts. During certain festivals, Helot children were forced to participate in rituals that celebrated their own subjugation. They would be required to offer prayers thanking the gods for the wisdom of the Spartans in ruling over them. They would sing hymns praising the superiority of their masters and acknowledging their own inferiority. These rituals embedded the ideology of their oppression deep into their developing minds. Young Helot girls faced additional horrors as they approached adolescence. The Spartans practiced a form of systematic sexual exploitation that began early and was designed to destroy family bonds and personal dignity. Helot girls who showed signs of physical beauty were often taken into Spartan households as domestic servants, where they became sexually available to their masters. This practice served multiple purposes. It provided sexual outlets for Spartan men, produced mixed-race children who could serve specific functions in the social hierarchy, and demonstrated to Helot families that they had no power to protect their daughters. The treatment of Helot boys was equally calculated and cruel. Those who showed physical strength or intelligence were marked for special attention, not for advancement, but for closer surveillance and eventual elimination. Spartan overseers would watch Helot children at play, looking for signs of leadership, courage, or independent thinking. Children who organized games, showed creativity, or demonstrated natural charisma were noted and tracked. One particularly insidious practice involved using Helot children as training tools for young Spartans. Helot boys would be forced to serve as practice opponents for Spartan youth learning combat skills. But these weren't fair sparring matches. They were exercises in domination where Helot children were expected to provide resistance without actually winning. A Helot child who fought too effectively might be punished for showing insufficient respect. One who didn't fight hard enough might be punished for providing inadequate training. The Spartans also used Helot children to teach their own young about the supposed natural order of society. Spartan children were encouraged to observe and interact with Helot youth in ways that reinforced social hierarchies. They might order Helot children to perform tasks, correct their behavior, or participate in games designed to emphasize the superiority of the Spartan child. These interactions normalized domination and submission, teaching both groups their expected roles in society. The family structures of Helots were deliberately undermined to prevent the development of strong emotional bonds that might inspire resistance. Children might be separated from their parents for extended periods, serving in distant households or working in different parts of the agricultural system. When families were allowed to remain together, they did so under constant surveillance, knowing that any sign of unusual closeness or loyalty might result in separation or worse. The long-term psychological effects of this systematic childhood trauma were exactly what the Spartans intended. Helot children grew into adults who had internalized their supposed inferiority, who found it difficult to trust others or form strong relationships, and who were psychologically unprepared to challenge the system that oppressed them. The cycle of oppression became self-perpetuating as traumatized parents, themselves products of this system, struggled to provide their children with the love and confidence that might enable resistance. Despite the sophisticated system of psychological and physical oppression designed to keep them subjugated, the Helots were not passive victims. Their attempts at resistance and the Spartan responses to those attempts reveal both the inherent instability of the system and the lengths to which the Spartans would go to maintain their dominance. The story of Helot revolts and Spartan retribution is one of extraordinary courage met with unimaginable brutality. The most significant Helot uprising began in 464 BCE, triggered by a massive earthquake that devastated Sparta and killed thousands of citizens. The Helots, seeing their oppressors weakened and disorganized, seized what might be their only opportunity for freedom. Led by a man whose name has been lost to history, but whose courage echoes through the centuries, Helots across Laconia and Messenia rose in coordinated rebellion. The scale of this uprising reveals just how widespread Helot resentment had become. Entire communities joined the revolt, suggesting a level of organization that the Spartans had failed to detect despite their extensive surveillance systems. Helot fighters demonstrated military skills that shocked their former masters, skills learned through forced service in Spartan armies now turned against their oppressors. The rebellion wasn't just about gaining freedom, it was about reclaiming dignity and identity that had been systematically stripped away for generations. Helot forces didn't just fight. They deliberately adopted symbols and practices that asserted their humanity and worth. They created their own military units with their own standards, proclaimed their ancient names for their homeland, and established councils that governed liberated territories according to their own customs. The Spartan response was swift, brutal, and revealing. Unable to suppress the rebellion with their remaining forces, the Spartans did something unprecedented. They asked for help. The same people who prided themselves on military self-sufficiency were forced to beg Athens and other Greek cities for assistance in dealing with their own slaves. This request was itself an admission of how dependent Spartan society had become on Helot labor and how vulnerable they were when that labor was withdrawn. When Athenian forces arrived to help suppress the rebellion, they were reportedly shocked by what they witnessed. These were men familiar with slavery and warfare, yet they found Spartan methods of dealing with Helot resistance to be excessive even by the standards of their time. The Athenians eventually withdrew their support, officially due to political disagreements, but some sources suggest they were disturbed by Spartan brutality against the rebels. The The suppression of the revolt took years and involved tactics that went far beyond normal military operations. The Spartans implemented what would today be recognized as systematic war crimes. The deliberate targeting of civilian populations, the use of starvation as a weapon, and the employment of torture not just for information but for psychological warfare against entire communities. Captured rebels faced fates designed to terrorize others into submission. Public executions were conducted in ways calculated to maximize suffering and psychological impact. Some rebels were crucified along major roads where other helots would be forced to see them. Others were subjected to elaborate tortures that could last for days, their screams serving as warnings to any who might consider resistance. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Spartan retribution was its extension to families and communities of rebels. The Spartans understood that executing only the fighters would leave behind parents, spouses, and children who might harbor resentment and desire for revenge. Their solution was characteristically brutal: collective punishment that could extend to entire villages. The aftermath of the Great Revolt saw the implementation of new control measures that made the previous system seem mild by comparison. The Spartans established permanent military posts throughout Helot territories, creating a network of surveillance and control that made organized resistance nearly impossible. They also implemented new forms of collective responsibility, making entire communities liable for the actions of any individual. The psychological warfare that followed the revolt's suppression was as sophisticated as it was cruel. The Spartans forced Helot communities to participate in ceremonies celebrating the defeat of the rebellion and the wisdom of Spartan rule. Survivors were required to denounce their fallen comrades publicly and express gratitude for Spartan mercy in allowing them to live. These rituals were designed to break any remaining sense of solidarity or shared resistance. The revolt had revealed the fundamental weakness of the Spartan system. It could only survive through the active suppression of the majority of its population. The resources required to maintain this suppression ultimately contributed to Sparta's decline as a military power. Energy that might have been used for expansion or cultural development was instead devoted to maintaining an inherently unstable system of oppression. Later revolts were smaller and more quickly suppressed, not because Helot resentment had diminished, but because the control systems had become more sophisticated and the consequences of resistance more terrifying. The Great Revolt of 464 BCE became both an inspiration and a warning, a reminder of what was possible but also of the terrible price that resistance could exact. The Helot system wasn't just about control and oppression, it was the economic engine that powered Spartan military dominance. Understanding the financial mechanics of Helot exploitation reveals how systematic human suffering was converted into military superiority, and why the Spartans were so desperate to maintain their system of oppression at any cost. The numbers alone tell a staggering story. At its peak, the Helot population may have reached 200,000 people, compared to perhaps 8,000 full Spartan citizens. This meant that every Spartan family controlled the labor of roughly 25 enslaved individuals. The economic output generated by this vast workforce was what allowed Spartans to devote their entire lives to military training while still maintaining one of the highest standards of living in the ancient world. The economic efficiency of this system was brutal in its precision. Each Helot family was required to deliver a specific quota of produce to their Spartan masters, typically about 50% of their total production. This left helots with just enough to survive while ensuring maximum profit for their owners. Those who failed to meet quotas faced punishment that could range from reduced rations to physical violence, creating powerful incentives for productivity. The Spartans also implemented what modern economists would recognize as a sophisticated system of economic surveillance. Helot production was carefully monitored not just to ensure quotas were met, but to identify individuals or communities that might be accumulating resources that could fund resistance activities. Helots found with excess food or materials could be punished for theft, even if they had produced those materials themselves. The system's true genius and its ultimate cruelty lay in how it used economic dependency to reinforce psychological oppression. Helots weren't just forbidden from owning property. They were prevented from developing any economic relationships that didn't directly benefit their masters. They couldn't trade with each other, accumulate savings, or invest in tools that might improve their productivity for their own benefit. This economic structure had profound effects on Helot family life and social organization. Parents couldn't build wealth to pass on to their children, eliminating one of the primary motivations for long-term planning and social organization. Communities couldn't pool resources for mutual benefit, preventing the development of the social bonds that might enable collective action. Every aspect of Helot economic life was structured to maintain dependency and prevent the accumulation of resources that might enable resistance. The Spartans also used economic manipulation as a form of social control. During times of potential unrest, they might temporarily reduce quotas or provide small rewards to compliant helots, creating the illusion that better treatment was possible for those who accepted their situation. Conversely, entire communities might face economic punishment for the actions of individuals, creating pressure for self-policing and mutual surveillance. The profits generated by Helot labor funded more than just Spartan military training. They supported an extensive intelligence network, paid for the weapons and equipment that kept Helots subjugated, and financed the diplomatic activities that prevented other Greek cities from intervening on behalf of the oppressed population. In effect, Helots were forced to pay for their own oppression. The economic model was so successful that it created a fundamental dependency within Spartan society. Citizens who had never learned productive skills became incapable of supporting themselves without Helot labor. This created a powerful incentive to maintain the system regardless of its moral costs. Spartan society had become economically addicted to Helot suffering. The system's efficiency also revealed its ultimate weakness. By concentrating wealth in the hands of a small population while impoverishing the vast majority, the Spartans created inherent economic instability. The Helot population had little reason to be productive beyond the minimum required to avoid punishment, leading to gradual economic decline even as the system continued to generate short-term profits. As we reach the end of this dark journey through one of history's most sophisticated systems of oppression, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The Spartan legacy that we celebrate today was built on centuries of systematic human suffering. The 300 warriors who stood at Thermopylae, the disciplined phalanxes that dominated Greek battlefields, the austere warriors who valued honor above life. All of this was made possible by the blood, sweat, and broken spirits of nearly 200,000 enslaved human beings. The Helot system wasn't just slavery as practiced elsewhere in the ancient world. It was something far more sinister, a comprehensive program of psychological warfare designed to break human spirits across generations. The Spartans didn't just want laborers, they wanted a population so thoroughly dehumanized that resistance became psychologically impossible. They succeeded in creating a system so effective at breaking people that it sustained itself for over 3 centuries. The sophistication of Spartan oppression should serve as a warning to every generation. The same society that produced philosophical insights about virtue and honor also created the Krypteia, state-sanctioned murder disguised as education. The same culture that celebrated courage and sacrifice also forced children to watch their parents being systematically humiliated. The same people who died heroically for freedom at Thermopylae denied that same freedom to hundreds of thousands of others. Modern attempts to rehabilitate the Spartan legacy often focus on their military achievements while ignoring the human cost of those achievements. We celebrate their physical fitness while forgetting it was maintained by enslaved labor. We admire their discipline while ignoring that it was built on the disciplined oppression of others. We praise their sacrifice while overlooking the far greater sacrifices forced upon those who had no choice in the matter. The Helot system ultimately destroyed the society that created it. The enormous resources required to maintain such an elaborate system of oppression, the surveillance networks, the military posts, the constant vigilance against rebellion, drained Spartan society of the energy and creativity needed for long-term survival. By the time external enemies began to seriously threaten Sparta, the society had become so focused on internal oppression that it had lost the adaptability needed to face new challenges. The irony is profound. A society that claimed to value honor above all else was built on the systematic destruction of human dignity. Warriors who prided themselves on facing death bravely spent their lives terrorizing defenseless people. A culture that celebrated freedom and independence created one of history's most comprehensive systems of enslavement. Perhaps most troubling is how easily this history has been forgotten or minimized. Popular culture continues to celebrate Spartan warriors without acknowledging the helot suffering that made their lifestyle possible. History textbooks mention the helot system in passing while devoting chapters to Spartan military tactics. We have allowed ourselves to be seduced by the image of noble warriors while ignoring the voices of their victims. The helots of ancient Sparta left us no written records, no monuments, no proud histories of their own. Their names, their stories, their individual dreams and fears have been lost to time. But their suffering built one of the most militarily successful societies in ancient history, and their resistance, however brief and ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated that the human spirit cannot be permanently broken, no matter how sophisticated the system of oppression. As we face our own moral challenges in the modern world, the story of the helots serves as both warning and inspiration. It warns us that sophisticated societies are capable of extraordinary evil when they convince themselves that some. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane, untold historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, like, share, and comment below. What other untold historical story would you like me to reveal? See you in the next one.